guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're going to discuss about a question that I get a lot of the times. So this is, when will my orchid start to produce new roots? It lost all of its roots, or it was stressed, or it's sick and it's bouncing back. When can I expect it to be healthy and even bloom? And sadly, this is one of those questions that I cannot give a straight answer. And sometimes I feel really bad. Who doesn't like straight answers? But instead of giving a totally wrong answer, I'd rather elaborate. So today we're going to discuss about what influences an orchid's recovery, and I'll give you my examples. Due to the move and all the stress I put my orchids through, it's clear now more than ever the difference between a non-stressed orchid that is adapting to a new environment or bouncing back, and an orchid that has been very stressed, has a long history, and I'll show you the results. So one of the things that influences an orchid's speedy recovery is the type of orchid you have. Now there are those orchids who, in my opinion, have a simple pattern of growth, such as Phalaenopsis orchids, and depending on certain details, you kind of get to know when they will start to produce roots, when they will start to bounce back. You have an idea about how they grow during the year, how many leaves they produce, what happens after they bloom, and so on. But when it comes to other orchids, things are totally different. And the best example that I have here is the Kalia Orchid. Now on the market there are quite a few Kalia hybrids which have pretty much continuous growth along the year. They can produce 2 pseudobulbs per year, and also they do not have a season in which they bloom or they grow and so on. So pretty much with a Kalia orchid that is stressed, the bouncing back time will not be that long. The orchid has enough time in 1 year to produce new growths, even if smaller. She still has time within 1 year to produce multiple roots, multiple pseudobulbs perhaps. So in this regard, having that type of Cattleyas means you will have a shorter waiting time. On the other hand, there are types of Cattleyas, usually species, which have a distinct growth pattern, and this is one of them. This is the Kalia Mosiae. She produces 1 new growth per lead per year, and she does have distinct patterns of blooming and also producing roots. So with this type of Kalia, obviously the waiting will be longer. If she is stressed, the new growth might be smaller, might not be able to bloom, so you need to wait another whole year for another growth to develop to reach the full potential perhaps, or at least to be at the same level of the older pseudobulbs. So with the Kalia, you have an example of different types of growth patterns within the same genus. But of course there are orchids with distinct growth patterns, well known, such as the Catasetum orchid. Now whatever the Catasetum is, you pretty much know it will produce 1 pseudobulb per year with 1 set of new roots and possibly a flower spike. If you have a very stressed Catasetum orchid, obviously again you might need to wait longer than with other orchids, simply because its growth pattern is in such a way that it needs more time to create new structures. So in my opinion, this is the #1 reason you need to take into account when thinking, So in my opinion, this was reason #1 that you need to take into account when it comes to orchid recovery and how long you have to wait. But there is another one which is equally important: the amount of stress an orchid had prior to you receiving it or prior to offering the proper care. And in this department, I have a lot of examples. So I'll take 2 Kalia examples for this. This is the pink no ID very fragrant Kalia that I have. When I received it, it did not have any roots and I needed to make it bounce back, and it pretty much did. What happened afterwards, if you're new to my channel, was that I suffered an infestation of spider mites, and I decided to unpot all of my orchids prior to actually moving to my new country, and I tried to make her roots acclimatize in water because it was easier for me to treat it. The roots did not acclimatize, so the new roots produced actually died. So this orchid needed to work again on producing roots. Next, I boxed all of my orchids, her included, and shipped them to my new location. The transport time of my medium from its location to its destination was 1 month. So for at least 3 weeks, my orchids were bare rooted. I was struggling to keep them hydrated until my new medium arrived. So what did this orchid experience? 1, loss of roots when I purchased it. 2, loss of roots once again when I was treating for spider mites. 3, moving from its environment to a totally new environment. 4, having to wait for a new medium and suffering from dehydration for 3 weeks. And I will just add this one just for the fun of it: root burn, as you can see in the back there. So within 1 year or a year and a half, this orchid has been through 5 types of stresses. Okay, let's look at a different Kalia now. Let's take the Kalia Mosiae once again. this orchid did not go through that much stress, and I'll tell you why. When I unpotted all of my orchids and plucked them in water and treated for spider mites, she was spared. I did not have spider mites on this one, and she had such a nice root system that my heart simply could not unpot it, disturb the roots. I unpotted it when I moved. Also, when I purchased this one, when I received it, she was in pretty good shape. She did not have root rot or anything of the sorts. So from the get-go, this orchid has 2 minus stresses, but still she did have to go through the move and acclimatize to my new environment, and she also had to bear no potting medium for 3 weeks as well, so there are 2 stresses here. About the root burn, she didn't go through it. Due to its pattern of growth of actually creating new roots when the growth matures, she was spared from root burn. She did not have any growing tips at that particular moment, and the older roots were not affected because they were in the potting medium and they were perfectly viable. Result? I have a brand new cane which is bigger than the last one, and I have a sheath, which with a bit of luck might bloom in the spring. 2 Cattleyas coming from the same place, my balcony, 2 different endings. And this is pretty much the story with many of my orchids. The orchids that were super stressed are now bouncing back as fast. The orchids that are not as stressed have more energy, and they are bouncing back much faster, to the point of actually not feeling they moved at all. But this is not the end of the story. There's another thing that contributes here: the size of the orchid. And when I mean size, I don't necessarily mean how big the leaf is, but how many structures it has. So here we have a small division of my Dendrobium kingianum. As you can see, not a big orchid, and also she's been through a lot because she only had 3 pseudobulbs, older pseudobulbs, and 1 leaf. Well, you can see the growth is not spectacular, so I can expect this orchid to bounce back in quite a lot of time, maybe 2 years, maybe even more. On the other hand, I have a Kalia here, and even though she went through the same amount of stress as the other one, she had multiple pseudobulbs. So her new growth is really not that tiny, indeed smaller than the previous growths, but not dramatically small. Now, these were the most important and basic factors that influences the bouncing back of an orchid. There are other secondary factors, such as, is the orchid a strong individual? Because sometimes you can deal with a weak one. Also, is it infested with an invisible disease, such as a virus, or even Fusarium wilt? That can seriously impair its bouncing back and actually its health overall. Okay, let's presume you already know all of these aspects. Well, the tricky part comes when you put them all together, connect the dots, and actually apply them to each specific case. Because not all orchids will react the same to the very same factors. I'll give you just one example. Let's say you have an orchid that has no roots. They start to grow and suddenly you damage them, and it's actually not hard to damage them. You can have snails, you can have bad potting medium, you can have fertilizer burn, and who knows what other reasons. But the point is, you manage to damage them. What will happen to that orchid? Well, an orchid without a strong root system cannot properly absorb water, let alone nutrients. Also, if the tips are too small to branch out, they're pretty much compromised. You need to wait for the orchid to produce new roots. Will the orchid have energy to produce new roots, additional new roots? Well, that depends on the orchid, doesn't it? So in the end, what you can have is a dying orchid. Even though it did its best to produce new roots, they do have a limit. And if the orchid depletes herself, there is no chance it will produce new roots, new growths, branching roots even, and so on. Now imagine this very same orchid without a root problem. The roots that started to grow would actually be in the pot at this time. And maybe this new growth would not have stopped growing because the orchid would have gotten hydrated. Also, maybe the older pseudobulbs, you can see one is yellowing, maybe they would still be alive right now if the roots would have been okay and were able to hydrate the orchid. And that is just one example. If you connect all of these things that can set back an orchid, you will pretty much reach a very logical end result. But what can we actually do to help orchids recover? Well, there are some things, but again, it depends on the orchid. So the number one thing is to provide proper hydration. When you are dealing with a sick orchid, you need to know it is far more sensitive than a properly healthy and established orchid. For example, an orchid that does not have enough pseudobulbs or enough roots will not tolerate drying as much as a healthy one. For example, Cattleyas. We all know they like to dry out in between waterings. With a sick Cattleya, you should really not let it dry for too long. It will not respond well. So whatever you do, however much ventilation you offer, it is important that you offer proper hydration. I would go as far as to keep the roots ventilated and moist most of the time, rather than letting them dry. Second, paying attention to external factors that can affect sick orchids. As I was saying, they're far more sensitive than established and healthy orchids. So you might have a high light plant, which in normal conditions can withstand direct sunshine or high amounts of light. The sick orchids will not be the same case. For one, you really don't want that orchid to transpire and lose water. Second, that orchid is more prone to burning than a healthy orchid. And by the way, this is a subject we will talk about in the future. And third, maybe some orchids can tolerate very, very low or very high temperatures. A sick orchid will not be as good at it as a healthy orchid, so maintaining a sort of an intermediate environment would be a better way to go with a sick orchid than to test out its tolerance to extremes. And third of all, you can actually adjust the care so that you make the orchid do what you want to do, not what it's programmed to do. Just one example here, because cases are limited. This is a deciduous dendrobium. It has a very specific type of growth. Due to the fact that I moved from a cooler environment to a tropical, subtropical environment, I knew already that my summer will be very, very long. And I already knew this orchid, in its condition and in its age, can make 2 growths per 1 year. So I tried to stimulate that. So what happened was, when this growth matured, you can see it's super tiny compared to the older one, I did not try to force a dormancy. I continued to fertilize and to offer water. Of course, my environment helped. It was sunny, it was warm, so the orchid did manage to produce another growth for this year, even though in normal conditions this might not happen. And as you can see already, this new growth is bigger than the older one, and it's not stopping growth anytime soon. When this cane will mature, probably later in fall or maybe in winter, I will definitely try to induce a sort of a dormancy, reduce watering, not fertilize, try to even induce some flowers. But in this case, it is possible to force a little bit the growth of an orchid. But understand that with some orchids, this will not be possible. For example, Catasetums, who have true dormancies, or Lycaste, or other orchids who do have true dormancies, lose all their leaves and so on. Probably if you do that to a Catasetum, you're gonna rot it. This dendrobium, which is the Dendrobium affilum, or PRRD, he doesn't have such an abrupt dormancy, if you will. He will not lose all of its leaves before it blooms. So it's a sort of a semi-dormancy. With this guy, I could break the rules. With a Catasetum, I cannot do this. So if you're gonna bend the rules, try to research and do it in a smart way. And where it's not possible, just accept the situation that it's not possible. So at this point, you might wonder why such a long video and such a long and elaborate explanation to a simple question of when will my orchid bloom? Or when will it be healthy? Well, to be honest, this is how I learned things and started to become intuitive with orchids, and I didn't need advice or help anymore at some point. And this is what I'm trying to pass on to you. At some point, you will know your orchids so well that you will not need advice, you will not need my videos, and so on. So I'd much rather you understand the process and everything that can happen through my experience, and have your own experiences and draw your own conclusions based on what you hear and the type of thinking that I'm trying to promote with my channel, which, as you might know, is a pretty long, elaborate, maybe boring type of thinking, but I just consider it the best, and if I like it, then I want the best for you as well. And that will have to do it for today. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to rate this video and subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you all next time. Bye! The orchid hobby is a wonderful thing. It can teach you to grow orchids, have beautiful flowers, and knit. This is what I'm working on right now. I swear, Synthetic is used in so many different situations, except for the ones it was created for.